Our speaker today needs no real introduction, particularly since all of you know who it is, and presumably you made the reservation to come and hear him. But so, at any rate, in the thought that he might, however, need some introduction, I've decided to call upon a fellow New York Times man who has known him far longer and better than I could have ever hoped. And that person is our own Clyde Haberman. So let's give it up for Clyde.
Back in September of 1995, I was newly back from a long stretch overseas, and I'm sitting in the slum that was then the New York Times newsroom. And there's this new guy on staff, really, had just begun, and he's sitting in the desk behind me, and I overhear him saying into the telephone, "Yeah, I know how to speak Buttafuoco." Now, I'd just been in the Middle East, and I thought maybe, is he talking about Abdulaziz Bouteflika of Algeria? Is this possible? So I learned a little bit that day and then later about, you're lucky. Why are you complaining? Is this not on? Is that it? This tastes almost as good as my chicken. So I did learn a lot about Joey Buttafuoco, but I learned even more about the guy who was on the telephone, the remarkable Dan Barry. As David said, he does not need an introduction, but that's what I'm here for. He writes with lyricism. He writes, in fact, so beautifully that I can't be the only member of the Times who'd like to break his fingers. He did the About New York column for some years, the Disland column for, I think, even more years. He's won many awards, the Berger Award for sure, several other awards, something called the Pulitzer he had a share in, something called the Polk Award he had a share in. This was when he was at the Providence Journal. But I think the award that I liked the best was he won a feature writing award, but he only got 5th place in it. And it was from the American Bowling Association. Actually, the American Bowling Congress, I should correct myself. 5th place. And the certificate and the $150 check were written out to Dan Barry. Dan is simply the indispensable man at the Times. You wanted the humanity of the horror of September 11th, you turned to Dan Barry. You wanted the humanity of what happened down in Louisiana after Hurricane Katrina, you turned to Dan Barry. Ferguson, Missouri, and its troubles, Dan Barry. Even the time zone ordeal with that wretched Jason Blair, you turned to Dan Barry again. He has been specializing in recent years in long form, and some of those, his long form pieces have become books, like on exploited farm workers. He also wrote a terrific book called Bottom of the 33rd, about the longest game in professional baseball, between the Pawtucket Red Sox and the Rochester Red Wings. And he's written unblinkingly with his characteristic clear eye about his own 2 bouts with cancer. And he provided, for some of us, a mantra that's can serve almost anybody well in going through a serious ordeal. Dan's mantra is, fuck this. I told you he was lyrical. So yeah, he can obviously speak Buttafuoco. And he can, more importantly, he can write Steinbeck with more than a few touches of Carson McCullers, who once said of writing, she said, writing for me is a search for God. We're dealing with a fellow who was raised Catholic and who has indeed said that I need my notes on this one. He gave an interview to a Catholic magazine saying, I would say the liturgical language I was exposed to informs the rhythms of my language. All right, I'm in danger now of breaking into Ave Maria, and you don't want to hear this. So let me simply introduce a rare voice, a voice for the voiceless, Dan Barry.
Thank you, Clyde. You stole all my lines. I'm very grateful to be here at the Society of the Silurians, and I want to thank you for inviting this enemy of the people. And I send greetings to my brother and sister enemies at the failing New York Times. Some of them are here. Solidarity. Normally I abide by the standard of that great philosopher Julius Henry Marx not to join any organization that would have me. But in the case of the Society of the Silurians, I have made an exception and will be filing the proper papers to join. Thank you. Good night. I'm done. I'm just eager to learn the secret handshake. I suppose I'm here this afternoon to talk to you about This Land, a collection of my dispatches from around the country for the Times, what I learned and probably mostly didn't learn. But maybe I thought I'd give you a little background about me, or what I like to call this guy. I'm from an exotic place on the American map called Long Island. Its people speak a strange tongue and go through an annual ritual of mortification known as rooting for the New York Mets. There's some Yankee fans here. My mother was from Ireland. I get my storytelling genes from her. My father was from New York City. I get my "you got a problem with that" gene from him. They both grew up poor, which meant that they spent most of their lives on the outside looking in. There's no question I've inherited that perspective and applied it to my journalism and, sadly, to my social life. I graduated from college and promptly got a job digging ditches. I then got my master's degree at New York University and promptly returned to digging ditches. I tried a couple of times back then to get hired at the Times, even though I had no connections whatsoever. Actually, I had a cousin who works on the loading docks, and I actually, in one of my many letters, I mentioned that to Gerald Boyd trying to get hired. I said, "Dear Mr. Boyd, I know that the New York Times has a rich history of nepotism. I have a cousin who works on the loading." I did do this. Never responded. The first time was for a clerk's job, and this clerk's job paid more than what my father was earning, and it was a big deal to get called in for the interview. And so I didn't have any business clothes, and so I bothered my father's blazer, his tie, his belt, and his shoes. And I went into Penn Station on the Long Island Railroad thinking of all the big words I would use. And for some reason I was fixated on the word Hyperborean. And so they said, "Well, where did you go to college?" I went to St. Bonaventure University in the Hyperborean region of upstate New York. I had all these, I thought that would be very Timesian. And I'm all dressed up, thinking of big words, walking up 8th Avenue, and a guy is walking towards me. And I tried to get out of his way, and he came. It was like that scene in one of those Charlie Chaplin movies where no matter which way I went, the guy walking toward me followed me, and he was pirouetting and he was spinning and he was holding a paper bag in his hand. And then just as I tried to pass him, he pirouetted and hit me across the chest with his paper bag, inside of which was a quart container of beer, and it went all over my jacket. So there I was standing outside the Times building at around 9:30 in the morning, doing a matador act, trying to flick beer off my jacket just minutes before the interview. And quite frankly, I don't remember much of the interview with the Queen of Clerks. I think she was like royalty. No doubt she smelled the beer, saw my Irish surname, and guessed that I had stopped off at the Blarney Stone for a morning, pick-me-up. I do know that I never got the chance to use the word Hyperborean. And the Times never actually sent me a rejection letter. This is a rejection letter. This is also true. It was as if both parties agreed that this had never happened. I always thought when I was working at the Times that my photograph was like at the security guard's desk, like, "Don't let this guy in." And so I went back to digging ditches. Another time I applied for a job as a news clerk for the great Sidney Schanberg, who you just mentioned at lunch. And again, that job paid about $18,000, which was way more than what my father was earning. And so I did the interview with his clerk, and I thought it went well, and I returned to Long Island expecting to hear good news. And then after I'd spent another long day digging ditches, my mother called down to my basement room and said I had a phone call. Danny, there's someone named Sid on the phone. I didn't know any Sids. And so, of course, it's Schanberg, and he was calling from Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard or someplace I had never been to. And he basically told me that the job was mine if I wanted it. And then he said something odd. He strongly recommended that I not take the job. If I wanted to be a journalist, this was not the job for me, he said. Get a small job at a job at a small paper, learn the craft, bang around a bit. It's the only way to learn about real life. And so I took his advice, and I'm forever grateful to Sidney Schanberg, though I really could have used that 18 grand, quite frankly. So after applying to every newspaper on the Eastern Seaboard, I finally get hired by a small afternoon paper in Connecticut called the Manchester Journal-Enquirer. And the interview was with the editor and his dog, a Scottish terrier named Terry. The editor, this is a true story, the editor sat in one chair and the dog sat in the other. And at one point, the editor left the room for about 10 minutes. So it was just me and the dog. And we're just looking at each other, sizing each other up. And it was clear that if this dog didn't like me, there was no way I was getting this job. So the editor came back in, and he looked at the dog, and the dog went like this. And I got the job. That's a true story. I attended a lot of school board meetings and covered a lot of fires, exposed a Catholic cult, as you do, and then got a job at the Providence Journal in about 1987. And Rhode Island, I don't know if you know much about Rhode Island, but it's what law enforcement officials like to say, a target-rich environment. I had a ball. But when I joined the Providence Journal in 87, it was a family-owned newspaper. There were more than a dozen editors and reporters in the Warwick Bureau alone. I don't know if you know Rhode Island, but the Providence Journal at that time had 8 or 9 bureaus in the smallest state of the Union, everywhere, okay? Warwick. I was the bureau chief in West Warwick, which is about 5 miles from Warwick, right? So at that time, the paper had the talent and resources to, inform the public, serve as a government watchdog, and produce really good narrative journalism that became the envy of newsrooms around the country. Now the Providence Journal is owned by one of those out-of-state hedge funds or private equity firms that wouldn't know Providence from Pawtucket or a lead from a kicker. The paper has maybe 15 reporters in toto, and this, of course, is bad for journalism, bad for Rhode Island, and bad for democracy, and as we, I think, all agree, it leads to an uninformed, uninvolved electorate. While I was there, I became kind of a Boswell to the Patriarcha crime family, and it's a weird thing, but it's no joke. I knew more about Raymond Ellis Patriarcha than I did about my own father. I spend my days writing about Junior and Nicky and Nino and Blackjack, the Saint, Baby Shacks, and of course, Anthony the Moron Mirabella. You can tell by his nickname he did not survive. Then somehow I got hired by the Times. It was clearly some kind of clerical mix-up because I'm not a Timesian guy like Clyde. But it didn't matter. Everyone in my family was impressed, especially my mother-in-law. She absolutely adored the New York Times, she told me, because the pages for the book review were perfect for cleaning windows. I had visions of being posted to Paris or London or Berlin, and instead I was given the very influential position of Long Island bureau chief in charge of a staff of 1. I would like now to read all of my stories with the dateline of Mineola. Would you mind? After that, I became acting police bureau chief, then City Hall bureau chief during the administration of Colleen? Rudy Giuliani. All I did back then was live and breathe Giuliani because he was always doing something interesting. Cutting off funding to a museum, getting into a fight with people who like ferrets, using a press conference to notify his wife that he was breaking up with her. As you do. Then, as Clyde said, I was diagnosed with cancer, and it was the kind of cancer that has your doctor, like, not looking at you, like he won't look at you as he's telling you. It was a very dire prognosis, but there was one benefit. I didn't have to care about Rudy Giuliani anymore. The doctors at Sloan Kettering, and I always give shout-outs to Memorial Sloan Kettering, honestly didn't know what to do with me. Finally, they slapped together a chemo cocktail that included pretty much anything they could find on the shelf. It was liquid plumber, Drano, and a quart of old granddad bourbon. Whatever it was, it worked, so I'm grateful. I returned to the newsroom grateful but confused. A changed guy, I think, because of this awkward confrontation with mortality. I used to be kind of an investigative reporter type. That kind of fell away. I think I came to understand more acutely the preciousness of life and apparently the preciousness of cliches. But it was true. It changed me as a reporter, and I was less interested in gotcha journalism and more interested in bearing witness and finding the epiphany in the small and quiet moments and just really noticing. And then 9/11, we don't have to talk about that. That was pretty much all I wrote about for a year, and in a way, I think we're all still writing about it. After a while, the Times gave me perhaps the best assignment at the newspaper, bar none, the About New York column, which meant writing 2 columns a week about the greatest city in the world. And in the spirit of Mike Berger, I looked for the small moments, the funny, the poignant, the uncommon, like the time they found a tiger living in a Harlem apartment. I'm going to pause here and talk about that for a second. So imagine you're Jim Braheny. You're a zoo official at the Bronx, an official at the Bronx Zoo. You're the kind of guy who wears ties with animal patterns. You're the kind of guy who married another zoo employee at the zoo. So you're committed to the zoo. One day you're minding your own business when you get a call from the NYPD saying, "We got a situation." "Oh, do tell, officer, what kind of situation?" "A tiger in an apartment kind of situation." So I don't know if you recall this, but some knucklehead had raised a tiger, which he called Ming, in his apartment, as you do. He also kept a 280-pound alligator named Al, but forget Al. He doesn't really matter in this story. The tiger eventually grew so big that the owner could only open the door, throw in raw chicken, and slam the door shut. He wasn't always quick, apparently, because he showed up at the hospital one night to say that his pit bull had nipped him in the thigh. A doctor looked at the wound and immediately notified the police. So a couple of remarkable side notes, right? So first of all, this New York City doctor apparently recognized an injury caused by a tiger. That's some good doctoring. Also, many of the residents in the building knew about Ming the tiger, but never said anything. So they would hear Ming padding about or roaring at times. Just another day. So this Bronx Zoo official and his 2 assistants drive down in a zoo van, and while they're driving down, they're convincing themselves this couldn't be a tiger. It's a mistake. It's probably a large feral cat. But the police escorted them to a television monitor with a live feed that had been set up in this 5th-floor apartment, and they look at it and say, "Yeah, that's a Bengal tiger." And it was probably sitting there watching Seinfeld, So they came up with a tactical plan, and what they did was they had a police officer rappel down the side of the building and then shoot a tranquilizer dart. This actually happened. To rappel down the side of the building, shoot a tranquilizer dart into the tiger, and they heard a roar, and then the tiger kind of lumbers out of view. And now it's time for the Bronx Zoo's SWAT team. They waited a half hour for the tranquilizer to take effect, and then Mr. Braheny and his 2 aides, along with some police officers, tiptoed into the apartment where it was quiet. We were not working in a controlled environment. Let me say that again. We were not working in a controlled environment, Brahini told me. They had no trouble finding the drugged inert tiger. Its striped coat did not exactly blend. Then with a 5-foot pole, Brahini poked the tiger. Once, twice, 3 times. Okay, the tiger is out. So the tiger team dragged the animal into the hallway and somehow lifted it onto a gurney. They go to the elevator arrives, and they cram in. The cops, the zoo people, the tiger on a gurney, and someone pushed the button for the ground floor. The elevator goes up. 6, 7, 8, 9. There's a friggin' tiger in the elevator. 10, 11. The door opens, and there's a woman there, older, and she's holding 2 Gristedes bags. And Brahini says, next elevator. So in 2005, I had another bout with cancer because I didn't get the message the first time. And then after that, I was writing the About New York column, just absolutely loving it. And then Hurricane Katrina hits the Gulf Coast. And I really felt the urge again to bear witness. And I, convinced my editors to let me go down and see what I could see. And they were just really glad to get me out of the newsroom. So one of the first days I was there, I was with the great Times photographer, Nicole Benjavino. And we're just driving through the damage, And we're in downtown. And we look to our right on Union Street, and there's a tarp in the middle of the street, and there's a traffic cone, and underneath the tarp you can see feet peeking out, okay? So it's a dead body, or it looks to be a dead body. You say, it can't be a dead body. How could it be a body, right? And so it was interesting because at that time the coroner was complaining that foreign news reporters were coming here with mannequins and staging scenes of death. And so I got out of the car to see if it was actually a body. Like, this is like surreal, right? So I go over, yeah, it's a goddamn body. And I came back and I told Nicole, and we're sitting there trying to figure out like what to do. Why is a body covered with a tarp with a traffic cone at its head, and its legs are lifted in like rigor mortis? Like, what the hell? So while we're watching, we see several National Guardsmen walk over to the body, and we say, all right, the authorities are here. And the guardsmen look at the body, then they just turn away. A couple of them bless themselves. Then one guy turns around and takes a photograph. So Nicole and I can't get our brain around this. We're actually kind of freaked out. And so we drive around the rest of the city, covering other dystopian moments under this hot September sun. And when we returned at dusk, we were saying, no ways that body's still there. Of course the body was still there. So I informed the Louisiana State Trooper who was around the corner. He knew all about it. In fact, he was the one who had arranged the placement of those traffic cones just so that some, he said, CNN news truck wouldn't run over it. So there was a curfew, and we drove back to Baton Rouge and then came back in the morning making bets with ourselves. No way is that body still there. This is the United States of America. We collect our dead, don't we? The body's still there. Like a piece of used furniture left out for garbage collection. Nicole and I spent the day wandering the rest of the city bearing witness. She drove and I was writing the story on my laptop in the passenger seat. I knew how the story would begin, a body on Union Street. I didn't know how it would end. So now it's another dusk, it's another curfew, and we return, and the goddamn body's still there. So professional dispassion gave way to disappointment, which is another way of saying rage. Would this dead son of New Orleans have been left there for days if he had been white and not African American? How could a corpse be left to decompose like carrion on a downtown street in a major American city? It was there for several days 3 days before I came upon it. I wrote what I saw and felt, and in the morning after the story appeared on the front page of the Times, the body was collected. So my experiences in New Orleans sparked this mad idea to try and do the About New York column only nationally. So think about that. That's mad. You know, although New York City has more than 8 million people and it's like 300 square miles, what have you, there's a stipulated sense of place here. Even if you're from Muncie, Indiana, you know, okay, you kind of get it. Broadway, Times Square, the Staten Island Ferry. That's not true of this nation. And so it was kind of crazy to try and do that. It was insane, and so I agreed to do it. My family, by the way, was delighted to have me out of the office. So after a few beers with a couple of national editors, we came up with the name This Land. It was a little tip of the hat to Woody Guthrie. And then so it began. Spending the next 10 years, more or less, on the road, meandering through this country, visiting all 50 states, pausing as often as possible. I was very rarely on the news. Sometimes it would be if there was a hurricane or something like that, or Ferguson. But most of the time I was just wandering around, trying to employ what Tom Heslin, an editor of mine at the Providence Journal, told me while working on a long story about yet another scandal in Rhode Island. He told me, slow it down. And it's become a mantra as well as fuck this. I go back and forth. I don't use slow it down with cancer, let me just tell you. Slow it down, you know, take it in. Not just get the quick quote and get out of there. So Mondays would often start at Newark International Airport, and a few hours later I'd be in Milwaukee or Denver or Atlanta or Seattle, getting into that small rental car, adjusting the mirror, the driver's seat, scanning the radio, looking for something local, something maybe country music or the angry lecture of some storefront preacher, or maybe a local program called Tradio or Swap Shop. Does anyone know what this is? It's like a kind of a on the air eBay where people call in and say they have stuff for sale. And once while I was driving through West Virginia, I heard a woman announce that she was looking to sell a house, 16 acres, a bowling ball, and a sequin dress slid up the side. That's a country music song right there, isn't it? I'd already begun to worry about where to sleep each night, and this is a serious matter. I've slept on the floors of airports, in ratty roadside motels, in a bed and breakfast whose proprietor offered the use of her absent husband's bathrobe hanging there on the treadmill. I declined. In an unsupervised, nearly deserted Old West hotel haunted by the ghost of Molly, a maid who overdosed on poison and alcohol a century earlier. They kept her corset on display. I recommend Hampton Inns, by the way. They have nice pillows, and they're usually within walking distance of an Olive Garden or an Applebee's, which is the pinnacle of cuisine in certain parts of this nation. And then I'd be just driving away from the city along an interstate that led to a secondary road and then led to a tertiary road that might very well be unpaved. In more than a decade, I was pulled over only twice. Once on a remote road along the Mexican border by a deputy sheriff who didn't recognize the car and wanted to make sure I wasn't smuggling drugs or undocumented immigrants. I had no undocumented immigrants. And once in Kansas, because I was speeding while listening to AM radio, I was actually singing backup to the Moody Blues' Nights in White Satin. So I deserved that ticket. For a decade, more or less, this is what I did, beginning at the end of the Bush administration, through the entirety of the Obama administration, and into the Trump administration. I had the privilege of wandering this great, infuriating, contradictory, wondrous country. And what a gift the times had given me. Here I am in western Minnesota talking to a young woman named Minerva Hinojosa. She's 23, she's from Brownsville, and that's at the very bottom of this country. Every summer of her life, she and her family have driven up across Texas and Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska and South Dakota to Breckenridge, where they tend to sugar beet crops. They are the migrant workers. They tend our crops, the food we eat. Her mother, her father, who's missing the tops of 3 fingers from a cotton gin accident, choose hoe handles with their initials. Then from early morning until evening, they work away in the rows of sugar beets, keeping the crop free of weeds. But Minerva had a dream. She was pregnant at 13, a mother at 14, and she still kept believing that she could make a good teacher one day. She finished high school, went to college, paid her tuition with the money earned in the fields, and she became the first college graduate in her family. Then one afternoon, while she was working a row, and her mother was working a row, and her father was working a row, and her brother was working a row, her cell phone rang. It was a high school down in South Texas offering her a job as an English teacher. She shouted for joy. Her mother gave thanks to God. Her father suggested they celebrate by working another row, and that's what they did. Here I am in a retirement home outside of Jacksonville because I know that one of its residents, a 92-year-old man of short stature, once had a brief acting career. His name is Meinhard Robbie, and he played the coroner of Munchkinland in The Wizard of Oz. Who has not seen that movie? You know, I talked at a high school last year, and I asked that question, and about 15 of the 20 kids had never seen The Wizard of Oz. How do you function? But you remember the coroner, right? After the house fell on the Wicked Witch of the East, you know, based on a true story. The coroner announces, and this usually hurts to do, as coroner I must aver, I thoroughly examined her, and she's not only merely dead, but really most sincerely dead. Thank you. I'll be at the Holiday Inn on Saturdays. So now here's the coroner in his bedroom. His coroner's outfit, which he still has, with that big hat, is in the closet. And above his single bed on the wall where sometimes you'll see a crucifix, there's a photograph of his friends, Dorothy, the Scarecrow, the Tin Man, and the Cowardly Lion, making their way to Oz. Here I am in Nashville witnessing the execution of a man named Darrell Holton, who had killed his family. A week earlier, I had interviewed him, gotten to know him a little bit. Now he is sitting in the electric chair about 20 feet from where I'm sitting. He looks straight ahead as prison officials use large sponges to drench his head. As they get on their knees to sponge his ankles, all to improve the conductivity. Then it was very biblical. The lights flicker, he's declared dead, and then the disembodied voice of Tennessee pours out the loudspeakers. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the legal execution of Darrell Holton. The time of death, 1:25. Please exit. Here I am in West Virginia taking the temperature of a life in a coal town, or in Missouri where people are coming together to stack sandbags to hold off the rising waters of the Mississippi. In Vermont, where some teenagers have vandalized a home, disturbing the ghost of its former occupant, the poet Robert Frost. I'm in Baraboo, Wisconsin, at a reunion of retired burlesque queens, and I'm very grateful to those women for they taught me how to do it. Okay? The bump and grind. You ready? Put an apple here, an orange here, and a coffee bean here. You hit the apple, you hit the orange, and you grind the coffee. I actually hurt myself doing that, so I don't recommend it. All the while I was trying to change things up, to keep moving around the country, but also to keep changing the nature and tone of the columns. I didn't want them all to be uniformly sad or poignant or sappy or silly. Bill Keller once told me he was glad that I wasn't writing columns about the world's largest ball of twine, which, as we all know, is in Corker City, Kansas. You know. Well, I went back to my desk and removed the world's largest ball of twine from my to-do list. Damn. I wasn't trying to write love letters to America so much as letters intended to be like mirrors. Look, this is who we are in all our wonder and complexity and failure. Here I am in Springfield, Massachusetts, where an African-American church under construction burns to the ground on election night 2008. Bishop Bryant Robinson, the pastor of this church, which is called the Macedonia Church of God in Christ, was awakened in the middle of the night. He rushed to the scene where he saw black embers the size of fists shooting skyward and float down like broken pieces of the cold New England night. A couple of white men would later be convicted of arson. It would turn out that they were so angry that this country would have its first black president that their only response that they could come up with was burn a black church down. Bishop Robinson is 71. He's got high blood pressure. He had spent years trying to build this new church. Someone eased him into a chair. Someone draped a blanket over his shoulders. All he had worked for was gone. As election night melted away, as memories of the past tempered thoughts of the future, the bishop sat in the chair, thinking and praying. Behind him were stacked 5 gold-painted shovels from the groundbreaking. In front of him, the fire. Above him, the mysterious pitch of the night. And a thought came to him, build again. 3 years later, I returned to Springfield, where Bishop Robinson gave me a tour of his new and beautiful church. Yeah, thank you. Finally, here I am in South Dakota, where in the prairie monotony along Highway 85, I see a sign the size of a cafeteria tray, and it says simply, Center of the Nation, 7.8 miles. I follow the sign, and for a few miles along an unpaved road, I see only antelope, sheep, and grass. For a while, this country's geographic center, the theoretical balance point, bounced around the heartland like the ball on an old movie screen sing-along. Then, after Alaska and Hawaii joined the nation, the center was determined to be here, about 21 miles north of the small city of Belle Fourche. Local officials saw visions of camera-wielding tourists, jammed parking lots, a Belle Fourche boom. The local newspaper, the Belle Fourche Bee, proclaimed, "Now we're rolling." Never happened. A new and improved Highway 85 bypassed the center of the nation by those 7.8 miles, and the old Highway 85 became the road rarely traveled, the nation's center, the attraction not attracting. Over the years, this dot on the American map was treated as a holy place and as a place to share a six-pack, an inconvenient place, a forgotten place, a place to vandalize, a place to reflect on something larger than one's self. These days, you could argue that there's no center to find in this country, that what exists instead is an ever-widening chasm between the reds and the blues, the rural and the urban, the haves and have-nots, us and them. And here I am, driving along an unpaved road, seeing nothing. But just when suspicions of a prank begin to invade my mind, I spot something red, white, and blue. It's a ragged American flag waving from the top of a pole that rises from the Dakota moonscape like the claim stake of some disoriented astronaut. And propped against a barbed wire fence is a hand-scrawled sign providing confirmation of what I see. I slip through the barbed wire and follow a worn path toward this solitary flag, its reds and whites shredded by the wind. Planted beside it in the soft ground is a disc-shaped marker left in 1962 by government surveyors. It says, Center. Hidden songbirds provide the only sound, their chatter recalling the giggles of unseen munchkins looking upon a stranger in his own strange land, forever driving, forever searching. But then, in the remote stillness, I feel a surging sense of reassurance that in these uncertain times, when we do not always seem to know or agree on who we are, at least somewhere in this nation, a center holds. Thank you.
Dan has graciously offered to graciously offered to answer a few questions.
Okay, I have a question. When did you know you were funny?
Still not sure. No. Maybe I'm funny, but not funny, ha-ha. You know what I mean?
What is the greatest challenge of the Trump presidency to you?
I don't have a quick answer to that. I'd say one challenge is trying to figure out how to stop calling us the enemies of the people. That would be a good start. So I'll begin there.
You've spent a lot of time out in Trump country,
Yeah.
and I'm just wondering if you can explain it to us. I mean, I've often wondered, how can they love this guy? You know, could you explain it to me?
I probably can't, but I would say that, like anyone else, like most of us in the media, I didn't see it coming. I remember being in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, going to see the Flight 93 Memorial. And, it's Pennsylvania, which used to be Democratic, mostly. And I was struck by not only how many Trump signs I saw, no Hillary signs, but also the Confederate flags that I saw in Pennsylvania. I can't explain it other than to say that people around the country feel disenfranchised. They feel that this recovery since the recession of 2008 and 9 did not benefit them. So there's more and more of a gap in how we appear to be succeeding, and I think it's stirred resentment. And there are other factors in there, but I think that's central to it.
Dan, first of all, thanks for your terrific remarks. Really, really wonderful.
Thanks, Ed.
So my question about, maybe you could tell us from your talking to people all over the country, it seems like in one way the biggest problem that we're all facing now is how does each side communicate with the other? Because, all of us can post our comments on the Times articles about what a creepy is, and they don't hear. So do you have any thoughts or any ideas on how to bridge that divide and how to get the two sides to communicate and have some kind of dialogue?
Again, Dan Barry. I'm not, I'm not David Brooks. So I will say that, I'm obviously a New York guy, and that means I have my own set of prejudices and perceptions. And when I went around the country, as I traveled around the country, I expected some animosity, the New York Times, the evil New York Times. And in all my years of traveling around, I only experienced that once. Some guy in Alabama said to me, "Are you a papist?"
No.
I said, "Yes, I am." I mean, wow, I'm kind of honored to be called a papist. And I think that one way to bridge it is to listen. What I was struck by was how eager people were to tell their story and how honored they were that someone had stopped and wasn't there following a candidate and then going across the street to the diner and getting a quick quote and then leaving. But by lingering for a few days, or in some of the stories I've done, a few months, they appreciate it and they feel like they're being heard rather than feeling as though they're being ignored by the East and West Coast elites. So,
Dan, over here.
A craft question, Dan. You said until your illness you thought of yourself as an investigative journalist.
I guess so, yeah.
But since then, you don't practice gotcha journalism. What kind of journalism are you doing?
That's a deep question. Poor journalism, unimportant, irrelevant journalism. I think obviously all the reporting that I do requires a kind of investigation, a kind of serious questioning and doing a lot of documentation and all that kind of stuff. But I guess I'm trying to do a form of explanatory journalism through narrative. And so I'm trying to write nonfiction, short stories that will have investigative details in them, but you also understand the characters. Usually in investigative journalism, it's in the 90s there was a style of investigative journalism. I don't know if any of you would remember this. It would be the Hartford Courant has learned this about the Mayanas Bridge, right? And then it would be 4 bullet points, each one more boring than the previous one, right? And you couldn't figure out what it was about. And so there's a form of I think there's a blending of investigative journalism that includes narrative, where you are invested in the story because you're identifying with the people who are affected by the issue at hand. So that's where I gravitate toward, I think. More explanatory journalism, understanding who we are, plumbing the depths of the human condition rather than trying to find some document that will put some guy in jail. I've done that, but that's what I prefer now. That's what I mean.
I paid for this mic. No, how often would you get tips from people? I mean, what kind of mail following, MAIL following, did you develop where you'd get a letter from somebody in Wyoming and you'd fly from Newark to Cheyenne to do a particular story? And how often would you be driving on an interstate and suddenly you see a sign and shelve whatever story you were going to do that week and just pull off the road and go off in some completely spontaneous direction? That's the first part. The second part is, how do people react to you as a New York Times reporter?
So I do have quite a male following, M-A-L-E. I have no female following, but I have quite a male following. Usually, it's a good question. Usually the stuff did not come over the transom. Usually it wasn't like, hey, there's an interesting thing happening in my community. Usually I would have to seek it out. And the way I would do it, one would be to respond to my own curiosity. So, for example, the coroner in The Wizard of Oz. Is anyone still alive? What's going on? That's an example. Or passion plays. I wrote a column about a 53-year-old man who's been playing Jesus for 20 years, and now he's too old to carry the cross, as funny as that sounds. But what's that like? So that came out of my own fevered brain. But then what I would do is I would say, geez, I haven't been in Iowa lately. And so I would go virtually to Iowa through the newspapers online, but then I wouldn't gravitate toward the Des Moines Register or the Chicago Tribune or the larger papers in those states. I would go to the smaller newspapers. And then when I went to the smaller newspapers, I would look at the community briefs as much as I would look at anything else to get a sense of a place. And I would find something that sometimes the local paper wouldn't think was terribly interesting. I went to Nebraska once because I saw a community brief about how they were going to unveil an obelisk. The town of Hupper was going to unveil an obelisk. Like, what? And the reason was Hupper had been bypassed. It had been a place that thrived on the traffic that went through its town. Then some Department of Transportation people said, no, we're going to do it this way. And then Hupper's going to die. So Hupper said no. The community raised a bunch of money. And they put an obelisk by the new highway. And it just says Hupper down the center of it this way. And so it was their way of saying, we're still here. We still matter. And no one else wrote that. But I thought that's kind of, maybe I shouldn't have written it. But so that's how I would do almost all my reporting, unless there was something like Ferguson or Mississippi overflowing its banks. Then I would go to an event. And then what was the second question?
About pulling off on the side of the road.
Oh,
discovering something en route.
Yeah, sure. That has happened to me. That happened to me in Washington State, and yeah, and as much work as I might do, say, go virtually into Iowa or someplace, and then identify a story and make a couple of calls. Invariably, and most people in this room know this feeling, it never is what you think it is. Okay, so I'm always open to the story changing or the column changing. That makes it more interesting to me. And while I'm going to someplace, and there was a lot of time in cars, we would notice other things and come back to it either that day or come back to it on our next trip. That happened a lot. You have to have all your senses open at all times. I mean, that's how I function.
So the other part was about how people reacted to you as a New York Times reporter.
You know, I said earlier, that invariably they were surprised that the New York Times cared. Okay, they were surprised, and so if I were in Iowa, I wasn't there during campaign season. Do you know what I mean? Or I was in a town that was never part of the campaign route anyway, and they were flattered that someone cared. As many of us know, people want to tell their stories. They just want to make sure that when you give me the gift of your story, that I understand how precious it is, and that I treat it that way. That's what they want, and it's a strange transaction if you think about it. I meet you for the first time. I've flown across the country, and I promise you, within 2 hours, I know everything about you, or a lot about you. I know about your parents. I know everything. You know nothing about me, and then I leave, and in my notebook, I have your life. That's a valuable thing to you, and I've always taken that seriously. That I'm going to treat it as the precious thing that it is. So I think I was never made to feel unwelcome anywhere except by that. Even the guy who called me a papist, I kind of laughed and we just carried on. So
Have you ever
I
had
converted him, by the way. He's now a Catholic.
Dan, before Betsy asks you a question, over here.
Oh.
Have you ever had any really negative reactions to things you've written?
Ever? No, right. Mayor Giuliani never had an issue with anything I wrote, right? He loved me.
No, talking about these human interest pieces you just described so eloquently.
Just out of the hundreds I did, there was one. I went to Montana where a lawyer, they used to do this, I don't know if they do it anymore, but they used to do marriage by proxy. So a soldier would be overseas and then he would want to get married, and so someone would have to stand in for him while he was overseas. And so a lawyer in Montana had cornered the market on this because it was only legal in maybe Montana, maybe one other state. And so it was a bit of a racket because he would be the officiant, and his daughter would be the stand-in for the soldier. And then there was another way. So he made a ton of money off this kind of arrangement. And it wasn't an investigative piece. It was like, this is who we are, this is what's going on. And he sent a nasty letter about me and about Angel Franco, the great photographer who was with me, and made some cracks about how we looked. Well, that's the only one out of all. And screw him.
If we let you pick the menu, will you come back to your club and talk to us again?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh, Dan, that question from Betsy Wade, one of the great copy editors.
I know who Betsy Wade is.
One of the great copy editors of our time. What is your relationship to the copy editors who have edited your copy?
Oh, I'm not one of these reporters who mocks or gets into screaming matches with copy editors. Normally, I've gone to the mat over a semicolon here and there, but I've always thought that copy editors. I always say I would ask the editors when I was doing the This Land column in particular. I had some great editors, and to save me from embarrassment. I would implore them to save me, to save us. I would say to them, is there anything that is making you perspire on the back of your neck with embarrassment for me? Is there any word that doesn't ring true to you? Is there any phrase that you think is overwritten? I'm Irish, so I'm always worried about being too, colorful or lyrical. And so I've always had a great relationship with copy editors, and I've always admired what they do and what they've done for me and for the paper. I've never had really an issue with that.
Over here. Your stories are so wonderful to us because we're all part of the brotherhood, sisterhood here. But I wondered, and because also they're so humorous, because we're getting slices of life of what it's like out in the hinterlands. And I wonder, did the people that you say they valued the fact that you were listening to them and you took the notes and you walked away, but were they ever offended by the fact that they think you were putting them down, that it was,
No.
playing for us, the sophisticates?
So I should continue. So first of all, I'm telling you a couple of humorous stories here, but one of them was about a tiger in Harlem, so that's in our own backyard. So after I would go back to just honest to God, imagine that you are Donna Dove and you're a diner owner in Elyria, Ohio, and this knucklehead comes in and then spends a bunch of time with you, months, and then goes back. How scary is it? I'm aware of that. How scary that must be for Donna Dove, right? And so when I am writing my column, or when I was writing that long series on that diner, I call up Donna Dove, and I call up her daughter, and I call up Pete, who was always there at the corner of the diner, and read to them what they said, right? But not only read to them what they said to check for the accuracy of the quote, but also to check that the context is accurate. I can quote you accurately and make you look like a total fool, right? We all know that game, right? So I'm not going to go to Elyria, Ohio, to do that, and then come back and laugh with my friends in New York at Donna Dove. That was never ever a thought for me, and it never happened. Okay, I'm telling you.
Over here. So I would imagine that these people don't regularly read the New York Times. So do you make sure, in addition to that you get them copies of the paper, that they see the story afterwards? And following up on that, do you get feedback from them afterwards?
Yeah, no, I do send them copies, but then I charge them. Plus postage. No, absolutely. How's that? I can't pay you for your story, right? We're not allowed to do that. I sure as hell can send you a copy of the story in which you're featured, right? So I always do that. And in fact, in many cases, I remained in touch with them. I wrote a long story about a bunch of men with intellectual disability who had been taken advantage of in a turkey processing plant in Iowa. And just the other day, I got a bunch of photographs from them of where they were on vacation. And in fact, the lawyer who handled that case, a guy from Texas, is visiting me tomorrow in the newsroom. So I stay in touch with a lot of the people I've written about because it becomes very intimate, doesn't it? And they become friends, or I, at least maintain a cordial relationship with them. And yes, send them copies at the very least. Sure.
Final question.
Wow, that's a lot of pressure. Dan, thank you. And my question for you is, when you were in Manchester, Providence, in New York, if you had an intriguing idea of something lit up your curiosity, you could drive out or hop on the subway and go investigate it. And if it didn't pan out, or if it turned out to be something different, you could pivot. How did your process change when you had to book airfare and accommodations and invest more time, energy, and time's money into the process? Did it change how you began? How often did you go in search of something and not find it, or find something so different that your editors weren't into it?
Right. So there's a considerable investment now. If I say, I should go to Seattle, Washington, and do a story there about a halfway house for people struggling with sobriety. Considering the financial investment and the investment in time, you know what? I'm going to find something. It may not be the story that I told the editor about, but I'm going to find something. And that was never an issue. The only issue was sometimes the editor would say, a tornado just landed in Joplin and wiped out a third of Joplin. Go find a story. That's the kind of pressure that makes me anxious, because so many other reporters are there. Anderson Cooper is there. How am I going to find something that's distinctive and column-esque? That's when I would get quite anxious. But I was pretty confident that I would find something somewhere. It's like Breslin said that to me one time. He was giving me a hard time because I wasn't writing a column because I had cancer. And he called me up and he said, "What do you got for tomorrow?" I said, he never said hello, as you know, right? What do you got for tomorrow? I got nothing, Jimmy. I just got back from Sloan Kettering. Screw that! Look around. It's all around you. Goodbye. And he was right. And I went back and I wrote a column. He was exactly right. So, thank you.
Thank you. And a reminder, folks, there are still a few books left. If you want to take home, you can actually take home some of his words. Isn't that amazing? And he'll sign it for you. Still a few copies left outside. Anyway, see you in April.